Hey guys, I wanted to continue with part two of the lecture over what of the characteristics of life. We went over this today in class, so I want to share it with everyone that's virtual and anyone that wanted to hear it again. So we're going to start off with the fourth characteristic, and the fourth one that we talked about today in class was that living things respond to their environment. Living things will make changes in response to a stimulus in their environment. The key phrases in that little statement there are these two words, stimulus and response. So living things, when they're exposed to a certain stimulus, they have to be able to respond to that. And we talked about that today in class about how, think about some of the stimuli that we are exposed to. If you were to go outside on a cold day, what would be your response? You might think that you would shiver, and the shivering is going to generate friction in your muscles and generate heat, which would warm you up. And also a response is that you would get chill bumps sometimes. And we talked a little bit about the chill bumps in class today. It's kind of an unusual, and I asked everyone, why do you think you get chill bumps? And it's kind of a difficult question to answer. And I don't know if there's a known if people know for sure why that's the case. Something I have read before, and you can take it or leave it, is that this is a relic in our back to our ancestors who possibly had more hair, and so when you're cold, sometimes like animals, like birds or mammals, when it's really cold, they will fluff up their hair or their feathers and trap this warm layer of air. And so I read this article once that said that's the reason we get chill bumps, because all of your little hairs on your arms and legs and have little tiny muscles attached to it, and those little muscles will contract and cause that hair to stand up. So that was the thought. And also, sometimes you might get chill bumps whenever you're scared, and animals kind of do the same thing. Their hair will fluff up when they get scared to make them look bigger. I don't know. I don't know if I believe it or not. I don't know if there could be some other reason, but it's interesting to think about. Also you think about if you go outside and it's hot, what is your response? You're going to respond by sweating, right? And so think about what sweating does to you. It cools you off because that liquid that is on your surface of your skin is going to evaporate off. And as water evaporates, it changes states of matter, goes from a liquid to a gas. It's going to take heat with it, and that heat so whenever it evaporates, it's going to cool you off. That's why whenever you'll notice step out of the shower, you feel really cold, because that water is evaporating off your skin. And sometimes this time of year, where we live, you go outside and it's hot and you sweat, and it doesn't really get much relief because there's so much humidity in the air. There's really nowhere for all that liquid to go, so it will just kind of stay on you. It won't evaporate off. But when you go into really dry environments, so like out in Arizona or Nevada, you won't even realize you're sweating because that sweat evaporates so quickly. And it might be 110 degrees outside, but they always say it's a dry heat, and so it cools you a little bit better, because that sweat evaporates so quickly. So if we look down here, the last statement there is maintains homeostasis. This is a very important word in a fundamental aspect of biology, homeostasis, and I've got a few definitions I want to share with you here. The first one is this idea of a steady state. So your body having a steady state, or maintenance of internal balance. Another definition that I wrote on the board, you can kind of add it to this one, is maintaining your conditions suitable for survival. So your body maintaining conditions suitable for survival. And really a lot of that, the stimulus and response goes with that. So, if you think about you're maintaining that internal balance, that those conditions, if you were to go out and eat a huge hot fudge sundae and drink a big Coke and maybe eat a bunch of chocolate chip cookies, what do you think your blood sugar would be? It would be sky high. Now, for most people, that's not a huge problem. They can go, your body will maintain, will balance itself out. You will secrete insulin into your blood, and that will lower your blood sugar. But there are some people who don't have that ability, and of course we know them, people with diabetes don't have that ability. Now, if they were to eat something like that, they're going to have to take a shot or have an insulin pump, or they would just have to not eat that because their body cannot maintain that balance that they need inside. So that is one of the characteristics of life there. And if you think about it, again, we think about viruses. Do viruses respond to stimuli? No, they really don't. So again, another one of those characteristics that I don't know that we could include viruses in. The next one we talked about today was living organisms metabolize. Metabolism is all of the chemical reactions that take place in an organism's body. A lot of times when we think about metabolism, we think someone has a high metabolism, and when they have a high metabolism, they can eat whatever they want, they don't gain weight, they're real thin, and that type of thing. Or maybe someone has a low metabolism, and that person just looks at something and gains weight. So, so you think about that, but typically overall, as we get older, our metabolism does slow down. But there are two main types of metabolism that I wanted to talk about today, and those are photosynthesis, and the one that doesn't get talked about as much is cellular respiration. So if we look at this picture here, this shows you how these two coexist. If we start up here with photosynthesis, plants take in CO2 and water, and photosynthesis takes place at the chloroplast. And inside that chloroplast, along with light energy, a plant will produce food for itself in the form of glucose, and it will release oxygen. So that is the process there of photosynthesis. And then if you notice down here, cellular respiration, it occurs in the mitochondria inside of your cells. People always recognize the mitochondria as the powerhouse of the cell. And it's because it produces energy. So at the mitochondria for cellular respiration, you take in the food you eat. And the food that you eat, we're going to kind of use glucose to represent that. So a lot of the carbohydrates you eat are going to get broken down into glucose eventually. So glucose and the oxygen that you breathe in are going to get converted to CO2, which you breathe out, and the water that you give off when you breathe, the water that when you sweat, when you urinate, and all that. That's the water that we give off. But really, what we get out of cellular respiration is this down here. Okay, we get chemical energy in the form of a substance called ATP, adenosine triphosphate. We'll talk more about that later on in the year, but that is really what we get out of the whole process. And then again, what we give off, the plants turn right around and use for photosynthesis. I like to look at the chemical equations for both of them. So if you look down here at the bottom first at photosynthesis, plants take in H2O plus CO2, and they get glucose and oxygen. So now you'll notice that the 6's are in here. That is to balance that equation. If we have 6 carbon here, we have to have 6 carbons here. 12 hydrogen, 6 times 2 is 12. And then if we add the 6 oxygens plus this 12 oxygen, 6 times 2, that's 18. And then here if you have 6 plus 12 is 18. So that's a balanced chemical equation. But you'll notice, and this is in photosynthesis, one of the things I mentioned in class today, and I was wanting to mention it again for you guys, is this idea that let's see if it let me. It's not going to let me write on that. Photosynthesis is what we call an endothermic reaction. So an endothermic reaction is a reaction that takes energy in. It kind of absorbs energy. So it is a type of metabolism that builds up. And cellular respiration is what we call an exothermic reaction, or a breakdown or a release of energy. And so think about it, photosynthesis, plants take sunlight and CO2 and they put it into these bonds of this glucose molecule, which is the food that they make for themselves. Whereas in cellular respiration, that glucose that we consume is broken down and energy is released from that, and we use that energy to do whatever it is process that we need to do in our daily lives. One thing I want to mention real quick before we move on to the last one is that a little misunderstanding that a lot of people have is this for example, this glucose here that plants make, where does it come from? Does it come from, if you think about a tree, if we planted an acorn and we grew this big huge tree, where does all that mass come from? Does it come, some people might think it comes from the ground, from the soil, from the water, from sunlight. You hear lots of answers, but really where it comes from is trace that carbon there, because that mass, that glucose is a carbon-based molecule. And what over here has carbon in it is the CO2. So it's kind of hard for us to imagine that, because CO2 is in the form of a gas and glucose is a solid, but plants convert that gas to a solid. So the same thing up here with cellular respiration for us, we give off CO2. Where does that come from over here? A lot of people think, well, the carbon dioxide that we give off comes from the oxygen that we breathe in, and you convert one to the other, but that's not the case. The CO2 that you give off actually comes from the food that you eat, this glucose right here. As you break that down, you're going to release carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. So that's a pretty cool thing that a lot of people don't understand. Let's move on to the last one here, and we'll go through it pretty quickly. Number 6 on the list is living things adapt to their environment. So adaptations are traits giving an organism an advantage in a certain environment. Variations of individuals is important for a healthy species. So it's important that you understand that adaptations aren't something that an organism kind of strives to get. You know, they don't strive to blend in more into their environment, or strive to become faster, or whatever it is. It's not a process that they're going to grow toward. It's usually a trait that they already have, that's built into their DNA. And if it lets them survive better in their environment, then that trait is going to be selected for in mating and get passed on to their offspring. So that trait will start to come out more and more and more through generation and generation and generation. If the environment changes, then that trait may no longer be favorable and be favored against. The typical example of that is, we think of the peppered moth. Peppered moth in the Industrial Revolution in Europe, it was this kind of light gray speckledy moth that blended in real well with trees. During the Industrial Revolution, a lot of soot was released out of these power plants and these big factories, and it started to coat the trees. Well, this little light-colored peppered moth no longer blended in, and so it didn't have that advantage. So it would start getting eaten. Well, there was variation among those moths, and some of them were a little darker colored, and they would live longer. They would reproduce more and pass those darker colors on to their offspring. Over a few generations, the peppered moth became darker and darker and darker. So that's kind of the way these adaptations work with living things. They have to be able to do that. So we'll talk more about that later in the year, probably more towards the end of the year. So these are the 6 characteristics of living things that we're going to talk about, and hopefully you get a good grasp of this. Hopefully you're writing these notes down, because I will be taking a grade on these notes. So if you want to write them down, if you want to type them out, either way, I'll ask for you to just share those with me here in a few days. So I'll see you guys later. Goodbye.